This occurred about 6 years ago. I was around 12, and my brother was 26. At that time, my brother had been in the U.S. Army for several years and was preparing for his second deployment to the Middle East, if I remember correctly. He had recently, 3 or 4 months before this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course and was now an active-duty SF engineer sergeant. He definitely wasn't someone you'd want to mess with. Since we both grew up loving the outdoors, my brother thought it would be a good idea to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, specifically the Sipsey Wilderness. Before he left for 9 months, the trip was going well until our third night camping. Around 8 p.m., we had set up camp, eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical stuff, guns, girls, and whatnot. For context, our campsite was about 50 yards from a large stream and the same distance downhill from a nearby path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was during summer in Alabama, so it wasn't fully dark yet when 2 guys in their late 20s approached and asked if we had seen any hogs while hiking. Since this was rural Alabama, we had indeed seen some deeper in the wilderness and told them so. Although they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously unsettling vibe from them. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, scruffy beards. They looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They hung around for a few minutes, maybe longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we'd been out there, how long we were staying, and generally sizing us up. Then they abruptly said goodbye and walked away. While I didn't feel directly threatened by them, I still felt uneasy about the encounter. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke up to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag, asking if he was awake and had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just stay still and don't make a sound." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was terrified. We also heard occasional shouts from different directions, but they didn't come any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down and then shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. My brother later told me the fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, but he was probably just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward another 3 hours. Around 2 a.m., I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quickly, and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart started racing again because I could hear the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before but still distinct. Without asking questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was easy for him after carrying heavy loads in the army. We quietly moved about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember how loudly I was breathing and how quiet my brother was when I heard the unmistakable sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol ready and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes, they had reached it. There were 5 of them and about 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 of them had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously picking up our scent. For those who backpack or camp, you know that nobody who comes upon a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was terrified. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't caught any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to each other when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, If they come towards us, I want you to turn and run as fast as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail, and look for the flashing lights. I didn't know what he meant by this, but I'd find out later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me land navigation pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to remove the red filter. He explained later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and reduces ambient light, making it harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point, I was so scared I almost started crying, but I also felt a rush of adrenaline and a sense of confidence because my brother believed I could handle myself. We stayed there for a while longer when, out of nowhere, the hunters started yelling, "Where y'all at?" and fired randomly into the woods. My brother dragged me back behind the hill's crest and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill protected us from any gunfire. They fired maybe 5 or 6 more shots and then started walking back the way they came. They got about 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. It turns out my brother had called the Forest Service on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed in the direction the hunters had gone, and the truck sped off, shining its spotlight through the woods. Once they were gone, we returned to our camp, packed up our things, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been and that we could talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to because I thought they might never let me go camping again. Creepy guys in the woods. Let's not meet again. You might get shot next time. Follow up. We never got any definitive information on what happened to the men we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff happening. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We were also fortunate that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I should note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterward, but I didn't see what the men and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail, inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off. We waited around 30 minutes for him to come back, and he said there were other officers out looking. There are only so many paths you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would also have to be done on foot. During the winter of 2018, I packed up all my belongings into my camper van and decided to move to Bernal Heights, a hilly area in San Francisco. After a casual break-in, an expensive tow, and a cold that left me unable to work, I decided to cut my losses and find an apartment. I'm sharing my experience to tell my story and offer advice to anyone considering van camping in San Francisco. With the ongoing pandemic, it might seem like an odd time to move to the city, but I imagine some essential workers still living there could benefit from reading this. You might wonder who chooses to live in a van in a city. I've met 3 types. 1. The tech nomad, a van dweller who relies on the amenities provided by their tech job. Think about it, if your workplace has a gym, meals, and a sense of community, why would you pay for an apartment? There have been plenty of stories about this happening at companies like Google and Facebook. 2. The true adventurer, a van dweller who is genuinely dedicated to outdoor life, often working seasonal or part-time jobs in the city to save up for long-term travel. Picture a construction worker living in the Dogpatch neighborhood. 3. Those who are truly homeless. I fell somewhere between the first and second categories. I recognized the privilege I had. My motivation was that I wanted to make the big move to the city, and I felt there was no better way to immerse myself in a city full of transient residents than by living in my vehicle. I also wanted to save money on rent. Initially, it was great. I felt like I had an advantage over my friends who were living in 3-story apartments. While they were paying exorbitant rent for a small apartment, I actually owned a home that I could take with me on weekend trips. I could easily leave the city and still enjoy comforts like refrigerated cheese, oven-baked brownies, and a queen-sized bed. I even looked good and stayed clean. This was because I went to the gym before and after work to shower. And since it was so convenient, I'd squeeze in a workout. This is how I showed up to work every day with damp hair and a post-workout glow. Then things started to go wrong. Someone tried to break in. One night while lying in bed, I heard my driver's side door open. I sat up and looked around. Street light was shining into the front cabin. Suddenly, the door closed, and I heard footsteps walking around the van. I think the person was looking for another unlocked door, but they had luck with the driver's door. It was the only one that had a problem. So, I quietly got out of bed and pulled it shut, waiting for them to finish their round and try again. When they came back, they started pulling the door. After a brief tug of war, they gave up and left. I looked at my watch and realized I had to go to work in 3 hours. Despite the adrenaline, I went back to sleep because I had sleep deprivation. Sleeping in a van is like sleeping while camping. It's cold, and you hear everything outside. It's hard to get a full 8 hours of sleep. I usually woke up every other hour. Over time, it gradually deprives you of deep sleep, which is essential for performing well at work. Being cold led to getting sick. I started this experiment in December, and I didn't have a heating system in the van. It was freezing in the mornings and at night. In the evenings, I could only lie flat under blankets. Reading even made me cold because my arms were exposed. I got towed. Imagine coming home to find your home gone. One night, I parked on a slight slope and forgot to turn my wheels toward the curb. San Francisco tows for that. It cost me $600 to get my van back, and I had to take a full day off work to deal with it. On top of that, the city gave me a $75 ticket. Learn from my mistakes. With the pandemic, I doubt there are fewer people trying to live in vans in the city. But who knows? You might be reading this because it's the best option you have. Here's my advice for making it work. To avoid the problems I faced, wear earplugs at night, turn your wheels toward the curb when parking on slopes, have warm clothes or a heating system, and make sure your van is locked at all times. Read and reread street signs to ensure you won't be ticketed or towed. Also, be aware of signs that prohibit vehicles over 7 feet tall or longer than 20 feet. Be prepared to move your van every 3 days. Get a bike or skateboard to commute from your van. The place you park might be more than 5 blocks from your work or gym. Identify your necessities and equip your van accordingly. Do you need to read at night? Get good lighting. Want cold beer whenever you want? You'll need a fridge and battery system. Everyone's necessities are different, but everyone has them. So be honest with yourself about what you need. If you don't have a well-organized kitchen setup with a fridge, consider buying all your food from delis and food trucks. The cost of buying groceries and cooking doesn't make as much sense when you can't store leftovers or cook easily. Make friends at the gym or elsewhere. It's hard to host people in your place, so find other ways to meet people and spend quality time together. When friends invite you to their homes, bring something with you so you don't come across as a freeloader just taking advantage of their couch. It will help keep the relationship balanced. I was camping alone in northeastern Ohio on my third and final night. I woke up needing to use the bathroom and walked about 10 feet from my hammock when I noticed a headlamp around 80 to 100 feet away. I observed it for about 10 minutes, watching the person stand up and sit back down. I put on my boots, grabbed my hatchet, and started moving to the right of my campsite, intending to figure out what he was doing. I got about 50 yards from my site and began heading towards him when I noticed another headlamp, about 40 feet away, moving around. I dropped to the ground and covered myself with some leaves. The person walked about 10 feet from where I was lying, then stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished a beer. He tossed the can on the ground. After he was far enough away that he couldn't hear me, I got up and started moving towards the first guy again. I got close enough to hear his phone receiving texts. Quietly, I moved even closer until I could see his face illuminated by the phone screen. That's when he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. I lay on the ground for a moment, then made my way back toward my site. I stopped when I heard my tarp, which was above my hammock, being torn apart. I could see flashlights flickering on and off and heard them talking about how he was just here. I stayed on the ground and watched as my flashlight was taken and gradually became just a faint light in the distance. When the sun rose, I returned to find my entire campsite destroyed. My hammock and tarp had been slashed, likely with a machete. My mess kit was smashed, and they had taken my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight. I went to the spot where I had first seen the man and found chewing tobacco pouches, 8 empty beer cans, and a discarded lighter. At the place where I had seen the other man, I found an empty bag that turned out to be for meth, a mess of cigarette butts, and a pile of feces without any toilet paper nearby. I've always liked old cars, so when I saw an old, beat-up van for sale, I couldn't pass it up. It wasn't in great shape, but it had a lot of character. The idea of using it for weekend camping trips sounded perfect to me. The van had clearly been through a lot over the years, but that's what made it special. One weekend, I decided to take the van out for its first trip. I found a quiet spot down a dirt road, not too far from some woods. It was one of those places where you wouldn't see anyone unless they were looking to cause trouble. It was just what I needed for some alone time. The van had enough space in the back for a sleeping bag, and after some effort, I got a small campfire going a few steps away. The first night was easy. I could hear the usual sounds of the forest, the wind in the trees, leaves rustling, and the distant calls of animals. Even though the van was old, it felt solid, like it was protecting me from whatever was outside. I fell asleep without any worries. The next day was calm. I spent most of it walking around the woods and sitting by the fire. As the evening rolled in, I got back into the van, ready for another quiet night. But this time, something didn't feel right. The air felt thick, and the forest was quieter than usual, almost too quiet. Lying in the van, I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling. I kept telling myself it was just the silence messing with my mind. But then I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It sounded like someone was walking around the van. I froze, listening closely, my heart racing. The footsteps were slow and careful, circling the van like they were looking for something. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or another animal, but the footsteps were too heavy, too steady. I held my breath, hoping the noise would stop, but it didn't. The sound came to a halt right by the back door of the van. I stared up at the ceiling, barely blinking, trying to make out any movement. Minutes passed, and there was nothing but silence. Just when I started to think I had imagined it all, the van shifted a bit, like something or someone was leaning against it. That's when real fear kicked in. I didn't dare move. I barely wanted to breathe. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. The van was completely silent, and the woods outside were even quieter. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the van. They were slow, almost like whoever or whatever it was knew I was inside. The footsteps faded into the distance, and slowly, the normal sounds of the forest returned. But I couldn't sleep after that. When the sun finally started to rise, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my things quickly and got into the driver's seat, eager to leave. But as I started the van, something caught my eye that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt, right outside the van, circling it over and over. These weren't animal tracks, they were clearly made by a person. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me the entire time. I never went back to that spot, and after a while I got rid of the van. But what really haunts me isn't just the thought that someone was out there in the woods. It's the fear that they might have followed me. Ever since that night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I'm home alone at night, I hear those same slow, careful footsteps outside, just like I did in the woods. They always seem to stop right by my door, and I'm left lying awake, wondering who or what is out there. I decided to go car camping alone for the weekend to clear my mind. I found a quiet spot off a dirt road, not too far from the main highway, but still far enough to feel away from everything. I parked my car under a large tree, set up a small fire, and settled in for the night. There were no other cars or people around, which was exactly what I needed. As the sun went down, the woods around me got dark. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the bushes. It was calm. I leaned back in my chair, took a sip from my drink, and watched the flames dance. The quiet was a relief, a break from the constant noise of the city. After a while, I heard a car engine in the distance. The sound got louder, and soon I saw headlights cutting through the trees. I wasn't too worried. Maybe it was just someone driving by, but the car didn't keep going. It pulled off the road, closer to where I was camped. The headlights turned off and everything went dark again. In the dim light of my fire, I could just make out the shape of the car. My heart started to race a bit, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was another camper or someone out hunting. I waited, expecting someone to get out, but no one did. The car just sat there, not moving. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the car's headlights suddenly flashed on for a second, blinding me. Then they went off again. It made me uneasy. I tried to brush it off, thinking they were just looking for a spot and changed their mind. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt something wasn't right. I put out the fire and got into my car, locking the doors behind me. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the dark shape of the car. Time seemed to slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. Suddenly, the car's engine roared to life. My heart jumped. The car slowly backed up and pulled back onto the dirt road. I watched as the taillights disappeared into the night. A wave of relief hit me, but it didn't last. Just when I thought it was over, I heard the car again, this time closer. The headlights came back, lighting up the trees around me. But this time, instead of stopping, the car sped up, racing toward my campsite. My stomach twisted with fear as it swerved off the road and screeched to a stop right behind my car, blocking me in. Panic set in. I fumbled with my keys, trying to start the engine, but there was nowhere to go. The car behind me revved its engine, the headlights glaring into my rearview mirror. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I couldn't see the driver's face through the tinted windows, but I could feel their intentions. They wanted to scare me, maybe even harm me. I threw the car into reverse, slamming into their bumper. The impact shook us both, but I didn't stop. I hit the gas again, pushing their car back. They honked the horn, but I kept going, inching my way out of the trap. Finally, I had enough space to turn the wheel and speed off down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust and gravel. I drove as fast as I could, my heart pounding, glancing in the rearview mirror. The car didn't follow. I didn't slow down until I reached the highway, where I finally felt safe enough to breathe. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Even after I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those headlights bearing down on me. I knew I'd never go car camping alone again. What I once thought was a peaceful escape turned into a nightmare, one that stayed with me long after that night. And sometimes, when I'm driving on a quiet road late at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, creeping up behind me, ready to finish what they started. I've always been a fan of camping. There's something about staying in a tent, away from technology and the daily grind, that reminds me I don't need modern comforts and gadgets to get by. Leaving my phone behind was probably where I messed up the most. But hey, it's Michigan. There aren't any dangerous predators here that make me worry, and I knew these woods like the back of my hand. I'd never had a bad experience out there before, so I figured it was as safe a spot as any. It was just my younger brother Tom, my sister Emma, her husband Dave, and me. We all agreed no phones, just tents, some drinks, and a break from life. I thought it was going to be a relaxing trip, but whether you believe it or not, something happened that night, and my life won't ever be the same. We all rode together in my sister's van and parked at a spot we used to hang out at as teens. We'd camped here a few times before, but usually with about 5 more people. "Oh, not the spider spot again," Emma complained. Years ago, when we first found this place, there was an old stump crawling with wolf spiders. After waking up to those big creepy spiders on us one night, we burned the stump to ashes and named it the spider spot. Relax, that stump's long gone. Besides, it's just a short walk, and my feet are killing me from work, Tom sighed. We all grabbed our gear and started the 10 to 15-minute walk, looking forward to the fire and, of course, the drinks. The worst part was the damn branches that seemed to jump out and stab your face as you walked. When we finally got there, we set up the tents and gathered firewood so the night could be spent laughing, drinking, and making countless trips into the dark to pee. It was around 1:30 in the morning when things started to get strange. "Did you guys hear that?" Dave asked, hushing everyone. We sat quietly, and after a few seconds, we heard unmistakable laughter. "Probably just some other campers doing the same thing we are," I said, chuckling. Without warning, Tom shouted loudly into the night, "Got any more drinks?" We all laughed and told him to hush. We were having a great time and didn't think anything of it. Then we heard running. "Tom, what did you do? You pissed them off." Emma started to panic a little. "Don't worry, they're probably just drunk and want to chat." Dave tried to calm her down, but I could see the worry on his face as the footsteps got closer. My heart was pounding, thinking we were about to have a run-in with some drunk strangers. "Got any more drinks?" It sounded like a weird recording of Tom, but off somehow. What the hell? All the hair on my arms stood up. It really creeped me out. "Very funny, jerks," Tom shouted. Then more footsteps, but this time running away from our campsite. "Must be some drunk kids messing with us," Emma sighed with relief. We all nodded and agreed it was time to call it a night. It was a bit of a buzzkill, and I think it spooked us more than we wanted to admit. "Hey, I'm crashing in your tent tonight, man," Tom said, glancing nervously around in the dark. "Coward," I joked, though secretly I was glad not to be sleeping alone. Once we were all in our tents, it was dead quiet. I think it was the only time I remember actually feeling scared. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, Tom was shaking me awake. "Dude, listen," he whispered urgently. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I caught the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. It was just outside the tent, maybe a foot away. "I'm crashing in your tent tonight, buddy," sounded like Tom, but not quite. I was about ready to lose it. Tom looked at me in sheer horror, and I knew I had the same expression because I was absolutely terrified. Then we heard the footsteps again, and whatever it was, it ran off. "Let's go now," Dave shouted, surprising me. They must have heard it too. We all bolted from our tents and ran back to the van as fast as we could. I've never been so relieved to leave the woods. This all happened last weekend, and I swear it's true. The worst part is, Tom called me yesterday and said he's been hearing something outside his house at night. He wants me to come over tonight, but I'm honestly too scared to go. I decided to take my granddad on a car camping trip. He used to love the outdoors, and I thought it would be a great way for us to bond. We packed up the car with all the basics, drove out to a quiet spot by a lake, and set up camp. The place was isolated, just the way I like it, with no one else around for miles. It was just us, the trees, and the water. As the evening came, we built a fire and had a simple meal. Granddad was quieter than usual, just staring into the fire. I thought he was lost in memories of his younger days. The night was cool and calm, the sky clear and full of stars. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Around midnight, I woke up feeling uneasy. The fire had burned down to just embers, casting a faint glow around the campsite. Granddad was still sitting by the fire, but he wasn't moving, just staring into the darkness. I called his name, but he didn't respond. A chill ran down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I got out of the car and walked over to him. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't really seeing anything. His breathing was shallow, like he was trying to stay quiet. I crouched next to him, trying to figure out what was scaring him. Then I heard it, a soft rustling coming from the woods. It was too quiet to be the wind and too uneven to be an animal. It was like someone or something was moving around out there, trying not to be noticed. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it towards the trees, but the light only reached a few feet before being swallowed by the darkness. The rustling stopped. The silence was almost worse. Felt like something was out there watching us, waiting. I turned back to my granddad. He finally moved, slowly reaching out to grab my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for his age, and I could feel his hand trembling. I knew we had to get out of there. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I helped him up, and we quickly packed up our stuff. The rustling started again, this time much closer. My heart was pounding as we threw everything into the car and slammed the doors shut. I started the engine, and as I put the car in gear, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, human-like, but something about it didn't look right. I sped out of there, not daring to look back. We drove for miles, my granddad silent and tense beside me. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I glanced at him. His face was pale, his hands still shaking. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we saw out there was still watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: we weren't alone. Whatever it was, it knew we were there. As we drove away, I had a creeping sense that something had followed us. It was too dark to see clearly, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I catch glimpses of that shadow watching from the edges of the trees. It's still out there, and it's waiting.